An applause. Thank you guys for coming. I'll see you guys later.
All right. Thank you. We are on the wrong page, but that's okay.
Are you on Chrome? Is that where your presentation is?
Oh no, it's on Brave or something, but it's like a different. What? Let's see. It's right here. That's the one. Does that work?
There you go. Yeah.
Oh.
There we go.
All right. We'll get this going in a second. Thank you for coming. When they asked us to headline tonight, we couldn't believe it. But here we are. It's a dream come true. All right. And this clicker's just going to work? Yeah.
In business.
Okay. So.
It's just us.
It's us too. We had a couple of co-hosts leave because of flight issues. That's what happens late in the evening on a Friday night, but we're here to close it down. So we're going to be talking to you, as you maybe can see, about retro profit organizations, a new type of org that might help support the retro public goods funding you have heard so many things about. And if you haven't, we're going to talk about that too. So, spoiler, light mechanism design here. Maybe that's exciting, maybe that's not. But okay, so retro public goods, we'll just kind of intro it. What's interesting about a retro public good? There's two qualities. One is you don't know it's useful until after it's built, pretty much, right? And then the second is it's a public good. And what is a public good? Well, it's something that kind of lacks some sort of market power. It's something that's maybe useful, but hard to build out via familiar market mechanisms or price via familiar market mechanisms. There's some other definitions. Some examples. Right, there's this great Henry Ford quote, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses instead of cars. That's kind of the flavor of what the retro piece is, right? Which is to say, you ask people, hey, I'm going to build this, and they don't understand what a car is, but you build it, and they're like, oh, cars are great. But, of course, we know cars are able to be supported in market mechanisms, so not a public good. So what's a public good that's not retro? Like a fireworks show, right? You can't keep people from not looking at fireworks. You put them up there. If they have a view, they get to see them, right? So it's a pure public good, but it's not retro because you tell people, hey, I'm going to have a great fun fireworks display, and everybody goes, yay, I'll buy a ticket. So retro PGF or retro public goods are this sort of hybrid, right? These two qualities combined, where you have the public goods quality, which is that hard to support via market mechanisms, and you have the retro quality, which is it's hard to explain it to people up front. And for here, we would like Justine, over to you to tell us about RPGF rounds.
Okay. I'm the governance lead at Optimism, and retroactive public goods funding is core to Optimism's approach. So actually 20% of the initial token supply is reserved for retroactive public goods funding grants, and it is our economic and growth engine. So to date, we've done 3 rounds where governance participants have decided which projects will receive basically grants retroactively after having built the thing that they've built. And so that has totaled across 3 rounds around 40 million OP.
Yeah. So I believe across all the ecosystem experiments with RPGF, it's something around 200 or 300 million that's been deployed in RPGF funding. So it's a substantial amount, and they've gone toward projects that have ideally already contributed value, and a lot of the cool experimentation that's been done has been about trying to ensure that's true and ensure that the capital is connected to those projects. So let's talk about why a new organizational form, this idea of retro profit organizations, could be especially useful here, right? So one of the things that happens, and maybe Justine, you can speak to this a little bit, is just that if you deploy retro public goods funding via voting, who gets to show up to the voters and say, hey, we're a public goods organization, figure out whether we deserve some of the money? So how have you kind of handled that?
Yeah, so to date, we've had all the governance participants that are eligible to vote on this. We call them citizens. All citizens have voted on all projects. In the last round, it was, I think, around 800 projects. So it's a high cognitive overhead for one of those governance participants to go through 800 projects and determine what is or isn't a public good, and then they have to evaluate the impact that those projects have had. So it's a very difficult task. The badge holders were very fatigued in the previous rounds. We'll adjust parameters to make their lives easier, but they really need strong indications when they're evaluating impact. And they like to look at parameters like the previous grants or funding these projects have had, and other what we call impact metrics to try to evaluate these things.
So I think one of the controversies that came up last time was about whether you should allow a VC-funded company to have
yes.
funding. Yeah.
Yes, this was a big controversy among badge holders. So again, like core to Optimism's kind of approach is that people need to build an expectation that they'll receive retro PGF. We're super early in that being possible. Retro PGF needs to become more frequent, more reliable, in order for builders to be creating things with the expectation that they'll receive retro PGF in the future. There also, in the beginning, while that market develops, needs to be some sort of like bootstrapping mechanism, because sometimes you can't build the thing because you don't have resources. So you need resources to be rewarded after the fact. And so grants, proactive grants can play that role. And so that can be from Gitcoin, it can be Optimism. Token House makes proactive grants that can later be rewarded. And there you can kind of, I think you're going to get into this later, but you can kind of see if the upfront grant fully recognized the value that was going to be generated or overestimated that value, et cetera.
Yeah, so just to summarize, right, like two crucial things. A lot of times these things do require capital to build, right? These are valuable, important things, these retro public goods. And so you might want them to have some way to get capital up front, rent office space, whatever it is, pay early employees through equity. But since we've already said, and Justine just pointed out, they're often hard to explain up front, right? Like that's the whole essence of a retro public good, is it's hard to tell people why it's useful until it's built. So even though grant funding can in theory play a role, right? Like the challenge is naturally, these things are defined as things where it's hard to show up and say, hey, everybody, give me some grant money. It's not like building a bridge where everybody goes, oh yeah, it'd be useful to have a bridge across to that other town. They go, yeah, I don't really know what this thing's about, right? And so, so one of the ways you might think, you know, and actually you positioned me well to talk about this, is there's a little gadget where you might be able to hook together the grant funding that we have through, like, for instance, Gitcoin, which has done it well. Scott was going to be on stage earlier, who is a Gitcoin co-founder, right? But quadratic funding is a very cool mechanism to fund projects that people can understand up front, right? It's a sort of like nice, broad-based way for people to get their voice heard. And so you could imagine a way of integrating like upfront grants, wait, I have a clicker, what am I doing? With retro PGF funding in a particular way. Thus begins a little bit of the mechanism design portion of the talk here, right? So if you look at this graph and you just think of the y-axis as being like number of people, number of votes, right? And on the x, we have perceived usefulness. Now we'll just think of these two curves as being two different types of project, right? So an orange project is one where most people don't get it, right? You can basically see that the mass is on the sort of not useful side. And the thin tail out there on the right is going to be not, there are very few people who get why it's such a big deal, right? So we can consider this kind of like a classic RPGF funded thing, right? Nobody gets it up front, or at least that's the precursor to an RPGF thing. And then the grant zone in blue is one where there is this kind of like fatter tail out to the right, where you can explain to enough people that maybe it's useful, and maybe you could get enough grant funding to actually build it, and that's great. So now we could think about this as a little more of a before and after story, not about two projects, right? So now you start a project and you show up to Gitcoin and you try and convince everybody that it's super useful. And your Gitcoin funding looks orange, which is to say most people don't get it. You don't get a lot, you try, right? But then you manage to build it anyway, however it works. Maybe we're able, you know, maybe there's some venture funding, maybe you take money out of your own pocket, who knows, right? And you show up to an RPGF round, and the usefulness looks like the blue curve, right? Suddenly everybody gets, this is actually a really cool project. Well, so that transition from orange to blue is kind of surprising usefulness, right, is one way we could call that, right? Up front, you tried to explain it to everybody, nobody got it. But then, once you built it, you showed up to RPGF and people get it. And that core idea of surprising usefulness is maybe one of the things we could use as a gadget to make the sort of larger grants ecosystem kind of interesting. I mean, it already is interesting, of course, but you know what I mean. Maybe a little more interesting, and we could use, let's say, do we have any measure theorists in the crowd? Measure theorists, raise your hand. Okay, no measure theorists, that's fine. So nobody's gonna be mad at me here. I'm skipping over all the interesting things, the Kullback-Leibler divergences and the Hellinger distances. Basically, we didn't have the data to do it. The data exists, though. It just so happens that we weren't able to get it in time. So we ran this project. My colleague Lauren, who was also going to be here, and I downloaded the data from the Optimism RPGF round and Gitcoin funds, the Gitcoin rounds, matched organizations who had applied to both, and then tried to look at what was maybe unique about these organizations and how much attention they got across each round, right? And so what we created is this metric. It's just basically log odds plus 1. It makes sense given the way the data looks. We don't have individual voter data. And what you can see is basically how much more did people get it once you were in the RPGF round than the Gitcoin round, right? So it's RPGF over Gitcoin as a proportion. Oh. And so when you run this and you look at the orgs, you get, these are the top 5 in most surprisingly useful. The ones that showed up for Gitcoin and got less compared to the proportion they got when they showed up to RPGF. I forget, did you have any thoughts on these that you wanted to offer, or is that or no on that?
Yeah, I won't comment on
That's a no on that,
projects.
no problem. Okay, understandable. I believe that was Scott's department. These organizations look pretty good to me. At first pass, it feels like an interesting validation of the mechanism, but it's imperfect and experimental. That said, it represents a way to sort of connect 2 of the most interesting grant projects we have in our space, right? We have Gitcoin for upfront, and we have RetroPGF for what you might call sort of ex post. And this is an interesting way to bridge between them and maybe make at least the RPGF side a little stronger by leveraging the data you get. So what would that look like, bringing it together, the retro profit organization journey? It would look like you show up, you apply for a Gitcoin round or some upfront grants. If you don't get what you thought you wanted, you become a retro profit organization and you seek some other funding, right? And then you apply for a retro PGF round, maybe bonused in the way I just discussed, maybe not. And then that can become the sort of grants life cycle. And just to sort of like reiterate what you mentioned well, Justine, what it does when you commit to being a retro profit organization is it means you're committing to not take regular profits. And as a result, a voter could, for instance, say, okay, well, you're not a VC-backed company, right? You knew you were going to be making a public good. You're not just a failed company with your hand out. And so that commitment might enable more voters to take you seriously, more voters to look at you and reduce some of that cognitive load. So I think, unless you do you have anything to add to that?
No, just that this need for a bootstrapping mechanism while the market for RetroPGF develops is actually mentioned in Vitalik's first post about RetroPGF in the first round. He talks about projects launching their own tokens, and then people could invest in those tokens with the expectation that that project would later receive RetroPGF. You can facilitate a similar mechanism through grants funding or through venture funding as well.
Great. All right. Well, do we have any questions? Feeling good? Okay. Oh, we have some questions. There was a graph. Oh, I would love to. Is it this one? Okay, I got you. Okay, cool. Yeah. So the idea is, right? We have on the y-axis, maybe we'll just say like votes or numbers of people, right? And on the x-axis, we have perceived utility. So just think of people voting on the utility of a particular project, right? And the orange project is one where you have people vote, and you can see that the mass is really toward the y-axis, so really on the like low perceived utility, right? Nobody gets it is basically the idea. So this is the Gitcoin phase. The Gitcoin phase, or I mean, it can be anything, but if you showed up and nobody got it, and then you became a blue organization, which is under the blue curve, you can see that there's this mass tire out in the perceived utility out there on the right. that would look like surprisingly useful, right? Because you ask people before you build it in this orange phase, is this useful? Everybody says no. You build it, now we're in the blue phase, people get it, they say yes. And so what we're trying to capture with this measure is some notion of surprise, right? This retroness of the public good, if that makes sense. Does that clarify it all? Okay, cool.
Yes. Yeah, what happens a lot with proactive grants is people overestimate the impact the project is going to have or whatever they're going to build. And with retro PGF, people are underestimating the impact that project or that project couldn't get resources up front because people underestimate it. And then after the fact, you can correct for that imbalance through retro PGF.
Thanks. Cecilia? It's a good question. So the question is asking about the shadow area between the two. If you were going to use one of the advanced metrics that I sort of like crossed out, if for instance you had fine-grained data about what each voter was allocating, you could use something a little more fancy and measure theoretic called Hellinger distance, and that's measuring something about the overlap between the distributions, the way they differ in these particular areas. It turns out that what we wind up using, log odds, does not do that, but conceptually you're onto something. The idea being that like there's something about the way these things overlap and the distance between them that's going to give you the interesting measure of surprise, right? Sure. You're saying, say one more time if you would. So the question is, can this make capital allocation more efficient, right? Before and after. I mean, it's an interesting question. I guess. Do you have a thought on it, by the way?
That's like the core concept, right? Is that it's easier to evaluate what has been useful than what might be useful in the future. So that's kind of, yeah, that's one of the core ideas behind the mechanism being retroactive.
Yeah. But I would say to build on that, what you're getting when you become a retro profit organization is you're credibly committing to a structure which is not going to be for profit. And we saw with the recent OpenAI stuff that these commitments to organizational form, deciding you're going to be a nonprofit, deciding on your mission, can be extremely binding and hard to change, right? And so the idea that you are credibly committing upfront could give people a bright line to decide on what they're going to invest in and what they're not. So in that sense, I think it could make it much more efficient in that it just reduces the sort of like cognitive load or the amount of things you have to look at if you want to specialize in one particular thing, for sure.
It can also create basically a business model for public goods that otherwise wouldn't have been investable or wouldn't have been created, right? Because if retroactive public goods funding is an effective allocation mechanism, then if you create a public good that has a lot of value, you have a chance to receive retro PGF in the future, and then you can maybe get upfront resources with the understanding that at the end, if you've created value, you will be rewarded for it.
Great. One question back there? Is what?
Results oracle. Yeah.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so yeah, in the original post, Vitalik references something called the results oracle in Optimism. That's essentially the citizen's house. And the question is, how accurate are the governance participants at allocating the rewards retroactively? It's early and it's hard to measure because when you get into this conversation, there's like how do you define accurate and what do you compare it against? And it's something that the citizens, the governance participants are going to have to do a lot of work on, is defining the type of impact that should be rewarded and then how you measure that impact, which metrics, and then once you've nailed those two things down, what is the distribution of rewards look like based on those metrics? So these are things we need to work on in the next year. It's why we do experimental rounds, right? We have to build this up over time. In the meantime, we need the bootstrapping mechanism while the results oracle gets more accurate.
I would say, just to plug the mechanism from my own perspective, I think it does make things slightly better in that, like, one of the failure modes of the results oracle we have, right, like at scale, is that people could just be funding things that were useful ex ante, right? Right, that's not the only failure mode, or that's not the only difficulty, but that's one of them, right? And that means you're not funding retro PGF. And so insofar as you have some credible difference, that can make it a little better, but does not solve all the oracle problems that we famously have to face. Cool. Anything else? Oh, hey, Cecilia, let's do it. I mean, I think it could be cool. Like, I think retro PGF is a big, important idea. It identifies a real class of things. And so the idea that people should take it seriously and that the experiments we do have a lot of relevance, I say absolutely. So generally, yeah, I mean, I think we're proving out very interesting things that apply to real problems. I'm far away from having people's ear to, like, get that stuff done. But actually around here, it seems like that's been done a little bit. So hopeful there. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think for now at Optimism, we're focused on refining the mechanism in Web3. But yeah, I mean, that's a great outcome. If real-world analogs can learn from the experiments that we're running, that'd be great.
Well, thank you all for staying out and coming. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.